In the shadows of the ordinary lie stories untold, mystery, fear, and the unexpected await. Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1. The Whispering Shadows. The rain fell in relentless sheets as Detective Elias Kearns stepped onto the scene. The small town of Ravenswood had always been quiet, tucked away in the folds of forested hills. But tonight, it was alive with flashing red and blue lights that painted the trees in alternating waves of urgency. The victim lay in the middle of an overgrown park. A man in his mid-30s, his body contorted as if he'd tried to fight his way out of something invisible. His hands were still frozen in a clawing gesture toward his throat. His eyes, wide open, seemed to see nothing, yet screamed a terror Elias couldn't comprehend. As Kearns crouched beside the body, his gloved hand brushed against something, a crumpled piece of paper half-soaked in mud. He carefully unfolded it, revealing jagged handwriting etched in deep, erratic strokes. He watches from the shadows. He knows my name, my sins. He said I'd choke on the truth, and now. The rest was illegible, smeared with rain or maybe blood. Kearns shivered, not from the cold, but from the unease threading its way into his mind. This is the third one in a month, came the voice of Officer Harding, his young partner. He looked pale in the harsh light of the scene. Same MO. Looks like they were strangled, but there's no bruising. And then there's... Harding nodded toward the nearby swings. The detective followed his gaze and froze. There, tied to the swing's chains, was a clown doll, its painted face grotesque in the downpour. Its smile stretched wide and unnatural, its eyes glinting like wet marbles in the flickering light. Elias stood, his jaw tightening. "I want this doll bagged, and the area swept for any other evidence," he ordered. "And give me everything we have on the last two cases. I want to know who know what we're dealing with." As the officers hurried to comply, Kearns lit a cigarette and stared at the park's far edge. The trees stood still, but he could feel something watching. He'd worked hundreds of cases in his 10 years on the force, but this one was different. It felt personal, like the killer, or whatever it was, wasn't just targeting its victims. It was leaving breadcrumbs for him to follow. Part 2. Vanished. The team worked in silence, the rain drumming against their jackets as evidence bags filled with small, scattered pieces of the mystery. Detective Kearns stayed near the perimeter of the scene, his cigarette forgotten, smoldering in the mud. Something about this case gnawed at him, an itch at the back of his mind he couldn't scratch. Officer Harding approached, holding the crumpled clown doll in a sealed evidence bag. Its plastic eyes reflected the flashlights, and its smile, Kearns could swear, seemed a little too knowing. "I hate this thing," Harding muttered, shoving it into the evidence van. "Who even?" "Detective Kearns," a voice rang out from the dark. Kearns turned to see Officer Sarah Langley jogging toward him, her flashlight bouncing with her hurried steps. She was the one officer he could count on to keep her head, but tonight her face was pale and her eyes wide. "Harding's gone," she blurted, her voice edged with panic. "What do you mean gone?" Kearns demanded, his stomach twisting. "He said he was going to check out the trail by the woods." She gestured to a path leading into the black trees, now slick with rain. "That was over 15 minutes ago. He's not answering his radio." Kearns grabbed his flashlight and barked orders at the remaining officers. "Pair off and start searching. He can't have gone far." The woods swallowed him as soon as he stepped onto the trail. The rain seemed louder here, smothering all other sounds except the occasional crunch of his boots on wet leaves. His flashlight cut through the darkness in thin beams, illuminating nothing but tangled branches and the occasional glint of water pooling in the dirt. "Harding," he called out, his voice sounding thin and hollow against the oppressive silence. The trail twisted, then abruptly ended at a clearing. Kearns's breath caught as his flashlight revealed something, a small patch of flattened grass. In the center, he found Harding's radio, lying face down in the mud. No blood, no sign of a struggle, just the radio, as if he'd set it down and simply walked away. And then he saw it, On a nearby tree, tied neatly with a bright red ribbon, was another doll. This one was dressed in a miniature police uniform, complete with a badge that read Harding. Its painted face smiled up at him mockingly. Kearns stared at it, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that Harding hadn't just disappeared. He'd been taken. Part 3. The Return. The storm passed in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. Search efforts for Harding continued through the night, with every available officer combing the woods. By dawn, the morale of the team was shattered. There was still no sign of him. Detective Kearns sat in his car, nursing a stale cup of coffee and staring at the doll they'd found tied to the tree. It sat in an evidence bag on the seat next to him, its uniform now spattered with dried mud. The badge with Harding's name gleamed faintly in the gray light. What the hell is going on? Kearns thought, rubbing his temples. He'd faced killers before, some brutal, some cunning, others just plain insane, but this felt like something else entirely. Detective, a frantic voice crackled over the radio. This is Langley. He's back. Harding's back. Kearns grabbed the radio. Where is he? By the east edge of the woods, near the old maintenance shed. He's not alone. Kearns's blood ran cold. He jumped out of the car, barely remembering to grab his flashlight as he sprinted toward the location. When he arrived, Langley was standing a few yards away from the shed, her hand on her holstered gun. There, she whispered, pointing. Harding stood just outside the shed, his back to them. His uniform was soaked, his shoulders slumped. He didn't respond as Kearns called his name. He just stood there, swaying slightly. Kearns approached cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Harding? Are you hurt? Where have you been? Harding turned slowly. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he'd been staring into some incomprehensible abyss. But what struck Kearns most was his silence. Harding, who never shut up, who always had a sarcastic quip ready, didn't say a word. Harding. Kearns took another step closer, lowering his flashlight. What happened? Harding's lips moved, but his voice was a hoarse whisper. I don't remember. Kearns felt a chill crawl up his spine. What do you mean? You don't remember? Where were you? I don't. Harding trailed off, his eyes darting toward the shed. Kearns followed his gaze and noticed something carved into the wooden door, a crude drawing of a clown's face. Below it, words had been scratched into the wood with jagged precision. You found him. Now find yourself. Part 4. Fractured Trust. The shed loomed behind Harding, its carved message glinting faintly in the mist. Kearns felt Langley step up beside him, her hand tightening on her holster. The other officers arrived soon after, forming a tense semicircle around their missing colleague. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Harding, Kearns said firmly, we need answers. Start from the beginning. What happened after you went into the woods? Harding stared at him blankly, his mouth moving as though he was trying to form words but couldn't. Finally, he whispered, I told you. I don't remember. Langley stepped forward, her eyes sharp with suspicion. You don't just vanish for hours and come back empty-handed. Someone's messing with us. Maybe it's you. That's enough, Kearns snapped, but even as he said it, a flicker of doubt tugged at his mind. I swear I didn't. Harding trailed off, his gaze drifting again to the carved clown face on the shed door. I went down the trail. I thought I heard something, like a laugh. I followed it, and then nothing. It's just blank. You don't remember where you were? Kearns pressed. What about this? He pointed to the carving. Did you do this? No. Harding's voice cracked as he stepped back, his face pale. I don't even know what that is. I just woke up by the shed. Woke up? Langley scoffed. We're supposed to believe that? Someone's dead, Harding. Someone's playing games with us, and you're smack in the middle of it. Harding looked at Kearns, desperation in his eyes. You believe me, don't you? Kearns hesitated. Harding's confusion seemed genuine, but there was something in his demeanor, something off. He wasn't acting like himself, and the nagging thought Kearns had been trying to suppress pushed its way forward. What if Harding wasn't the victim here? What if he was part of it? Before Kearns could answer, a shout came from one of the officers searching the shed. Detective, you need to see this. Kearns and Langley exchanged a glance before heading inside. The air was damp and musty, and the weak beams of their flashlights illuminated a room cluttered with old tools and rusted shelves. In the center of the floor was a small, crude table. Atop it sat another doll. This one was dressed in an officer's uniform too, but its face had been altered. The mouth was painted over with jagged red lines, and its eyes had been gouged out. A knife rested beside it, the blade still wet with some dark liquid. "Jesus," Langley muttered, stepping back. "This is getting worse by the second." Kearns moved closer, his breath catching as he noticed something else. A piece of paper was pinned to the doll's chest, the edges burned. He carefully unfolded it and read the words scrawled in uneven black ink. "He's back where he belongs. But you're next." Part 5, The Silent Forest. The shed seemed to close in on them, the damp air pressing against Kearns's chest as he read the chilling note again. The words seemed to pulse on the page, taunting him. He turned to the others, the unease on their faces mirrored by his own. "Get this whole area locked down," Kearns ordered, his voice harsher than he intended. "Nobody leaves without my say-so. I want every piece of this puzzle cataloged." Langley nodded, but her hand lingered on her holster. She hadn't stopped watching Harding, her suspicion growing darker by the second. "And what about him?" she asked, tilting her head toward their shaken colleague. "We'll deal with that later," Kearns said, but he avoided Harding's pleading gaze. Outside, the mist had thickened, shrouding the woods in a ghostly haze. As Kearns stepped out of the shed, a prickling sensation ran up his spine, as though the trees themselves were watching. He swept his flashlight across the clearing, the beam catching on gnarled branches and tangled undergrowth. And then it hit him, silence. The forest, usually alive with rustling leaves or distant calls of nocturnal creatures, was deathly quiet. The only sounds were his own breath and the crunch of his boots. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath. "Kearns!" Langley's voice cut through the stillness, making him jump. She was standing a few yards away, her flashlight trained on something in the underbrush. "What is it?" he asked, striding toward her. "I thought I saw." She stopped, her face pale as she shook her head. "Never mind. Just my eyes playing tricks." Kearns wanted to believe her, but the tightness in her voice said otherwise. He followed her gaze into the trees, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and mist, shifting like living things. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a sound. Laughter. It was faint but unmistakable, a high, tinkling giggle that made the hair on Kearns's neck stand on end. The kind of laugh that didn't belong to anything human. "Did you hear that?" Langley whispered, her voice trembling. Kearns nodded, gripping his flashlight tighter. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. The laughter came again, closer this time. Kearns's heart pounded as he swung the flashlight around wildly, the beams slicing through the mist. But there was nothing there, only the endless forest stretching into darkness. Suddenly, Harding screamed. Kearns and Langley spun around to see him standing by the shed, his face contorted in terror. "They're here," he shrieked, backing away. "I can see them." "Harding, calm down," Kearns shouted, rushing toward him. But Harding was beyond reason, his eyes darting to something unseen, his hands clawing at his face as though trying to tear away the visions. "They're coming for us," Harding howled, collapsing to his knees. "Don't you see them? Don't you?" His words choked off, and his body stiffened. Kearns froze as Harding's head snapped upward, his eyes rolling back. From deep in his throat came a guttural, inhuman sound, a rasping groan that didn't belong in the mouth of any living man. "Get back!" Langley screamed, pulling her gun. But before anyone could act, Harding's body convulsed, and he collapsed to the ground unconscious. The eerie silence returned, broken only by the frantic breaths of the two officers. Kearns knelt beside Harding, checking for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. He looked up at Langley, his voice shaking. "Get him to the station. Now!" As Langley called for backup, Kearns glanced back at the woods. The mist swirled between the trees, and for just a moment he saw something, a figure, impossibly tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the haze. And then it was gone. Part 6. The False Threads. The station was tense as Kern sat across from Harding in the interrogation room. Harding was awake now, but his movements were slow, his eyes sunken and hollow. Langley stood against the wall, her hand resting on her gun, as if expecting Harding to spring at them any second. "Harding," Kearns began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "You need to tell us everything you remember. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small." Harding's hands trembled on the table, his voice a dry whisper. "I told you, I don't remember. One second I was in the woods. The next, I woke up by that shed. Then what was all that about seeing them?" Langley cut in, her tone sharp. "You screamed like you were watching the devil himself." "I don't know," Harding stammered, shaking his head. "It was like I wasn't alone. There were faces blurred, twisted, and they were whispering things. I couldn't make out the words, but they were all wrong." Kearns leaned forward. "You've got to give us more than that, Harding. Look at the evidence. The doll in the shed, your name carved into the door. This isn't random. Someone's targeting you. Or he's targeting us," Langley muttered. "You saw that note, Kearns. You're next." The words hung in the air like a noose. Kearns tried to push the thought away, but it stuck, gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Do you know anyone who would do this to you?" Kearns pressed. "Anyone with a grudge? Someone you crossed?" Harding slumped in his chair, his face pale. "No one. I mean, sure, I've pissed people off on the job, but not like this. It's sick." Langley sighed, her frustration barely contained. "So, we've got nothing." "Great." "Not nothing," Kearns said, his gaze narrowing. "The carving on the shed, the clown face. That's not just a random choice. Whoever's doing this is leaving us a trail." Langley raised an eyebrow. "You think it's a calling card?" "Maybe," Kearns said. "Or maybe it's a message. Something they want us to understand." Langley scoffed. "Like what? I'm a psycho who loves clowns?" "No," Kearns said, a sudden thought clicking into place. "Like a connection. A pattern." He pulled a folder from the table and flipped through the reports from the first 2 murders. Each victim had been found in an isolated location, each with a strange item left near the body. A defaced doll, a note scrawled in blood. The details were too specific to be coincidence. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the notes. "The first victim worked at a carnival that went under 5 years ago. The second was an artist who painted murals, most of them featuring circus imagery. And now this." He gestured to Harding. "A cop with no ties to the others, except the clown." Langley finished, her voice softening. "You think that's the thread?" "I don't think." "I know," Kearns said. "Whoever's doing this has a fixation on circuses, clowns, something from that world. If we can figure out what connects these victims to that, we'll find our killer." Langley nodded slowly, but her skepticism was clear. "That's a big if, Kearns. What if we're wrong?" Before Kearns could answer, the lights flickered. A chill ran through the room, and Harding's eyes widened. "They're watching," he whispered, his voice trembling. Kearns glanced at Langley, then back at Harding. "Who's watching?" But Harding didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the mirror behind Kearns, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Kearns turned slowly, his pulse quickening. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something in the glass. A shadow, grinning, impossibly wide. And then it was gone. Part 7. The Spiral. The mirror was empty now, reflecting only Kearns, Langley, and the broken shell of Harding slumped in his chair. But the image of that fleeting shadow, a grin that stretched too wide, a presence that didn't belong, stayed with Kearns long after he turned away. His gut churned. They weren't chasing a suspect anymore. They were being played. Langley broke the silence first. "This is getting into your head, Kearns. That was nothing. Just a trick of the light." "Maybe," Kearns lied, though he could see from her clenched jaw that she didn't believe it either. "We can't keep spinning in circles," Langley said, her voice tense. "If there's a circus or carnival connection, we need to dig into it hard. Find out if anyone else has had run-ins with someone fitting this killer's profile." Kearns nodded, grateful for something tangible to focus on. "Let's pull every record we can find on old traveling shows, carnivals, any event that would have brought this kind of imagery into town." "Harding, you." He stopped. Harding's chair was empty. "What the?" Langley spun around. drawing her weapon. Where did he? The door to the interrogation room was ajar, swinging slightly as if recently disturbed. Kearns bolted out into the hallway, Langley at his heels. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. "Harding!" Kearns called, his voice echoing off the walls. No response. A muffled sound came from somewhere down the hall. A thud, followed by what sounded like distant laughter. Kearns and Langley exchanged a glance before moving cautiously toward the noise, their flashlights slicing through the dim corridor. The sound led them to the evidence room, its heavy door slightly ajar. Kearns pushed it open, his flashlight sweeping over rows of shelves filled with neatly cataloged items. And there, in the center of the room, stood Harding. He was facing away from them, his posture stiff, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Around him, evidence bags lay scattered on the floor, their contents spilled out. Photographs, handwritten notes, a blood-stained knife. And at his feet, unmistakable in its grotesque grin, was the clown doll from the shed. "Harding," Kearns said cautiously, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" Harding didn't move. "Harding!" Langley snapped, her gun trained on him. "Turn around. Now!" Slowly, Harding complied. His eyes were wide and glassy, his face slack. But his lips were moving, whispering something so faint it was almost inaudible. Kearns stepped closer, straining to hear. "What are you saying?" Harding's voice grew louder, his tone monotonous and chilling. "The wheel turns. The wheel turns. The wheel turns." "What the hell does that mean?" Langley demanded, but her voice cracked as Harding's words began to escalate into a guttural chant. "The wheel turns. The wheel turns. And it comes back for us all." "Harding!" Kearns grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. "Snap out of it." Harding's chanting stopped abruptly, and his body collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. Kearns caught him just before he hit the floor, his breathing ragged. Langley crouched beside them, her flashlight trembling. "This is bad, Kearns. Real bad." Kearns didn't answer. His eyes had fallen on the wall behind Harding. Carved into the plaster, as though with a blade, were the same chilling words. "The wheel turns." Below the words, something glinted in the beam of Kearns's flashlight. He leaned in closer, his breath catching as he recognized it. A key, its handle shaped like the grotesque face of a clown. "What's that for?" Langley asked, her voice tight. Kearns picked up the key, its cold metal biting into his palm. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm starting to think the answer isn't something we want to find." Part 8. The Lock. Kearns stood in the dimly lit evidence room, the strange key heavy in his hand. Its grotesque clown face seemed to grin up at him mockingly, as though daring him to follow its mystery to its conclusion. Langley paced behind him, her frustration and fear palpable in the tight rhythm of her steps. "You're not seriously thinking about using that," she said, nodding toward the key. Kearns pocketed it without a word. "It's a lead. We can't ignore it. Or it's bait," she countered, her voice rising. "This thing, whoever they are, wants us to follow the breadcrumbs. What if it's leading us into another trap?" Kearns turned to face her. "It probably is, but we're out of options. Sitting here waiting for the next body to show up isn't going to stop this." Langley didn't reply, but the tension in her jaw said enough. Kearns didn't blame her. Hell, he agreed with her. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. But that same instinct also screamed that they were running out of time. "Stay here with Harding," he said, heading for the door. "Keep an eye on him." Langley blocked his path. "Like hell I'm staying behind. You think I trust you to go out there alone with whatever this is? We go together." Kearns hesitated, then nodded. There was no point arguing. "Let's go." The key led them to an old storage facility on the outskirts of Ravenswood, an unassuming row of rusted metal doors. The place was deserted, the only sound the faint hum of cicadas in the oppressive night air. Kearns parked the car and cut the engine, the two of them sitting in tense silence. Finally, Langley broke it. "This feels wrong," she muttered, her hand resting on her holstered gun. "It is wrong," Kearns admitted, stepping out into the humid night. "But if there's a chance it leads us to the killer." He didn't finish the thought. The two officers approached the units cautiously, their flashlights sweeping over faded numbers painted on the doors. It didn't take long to find the one they were looking for. Unit 23. A clown's face had been crudely spray-painted onto the metal, its wide grin leering at them from the shadows. Kearns pulled out the key, its grotesque handle cold against his fingers. He hesitated for a moment, then slid it into the lock. It turned with a metallic click, the sound echoing in the stillness. "You ready?" he asked, glancing at Langley. "Not even a little," she replied, drawing her gun. Kearns nodded and pulled the door open. The flashlight beams cut into the darkness, revealing a small, cluttered space. The smell hit them first, a sickly sweet stench of decay that turned Kearns's stomach. "Oh God," Langley muttered, covering her mouth. The unit was filled with items that seemed to come from another world. Faded circus posters covered the walls, their cheerful colors warped and smeared with age. A rusted calliope stood in one corner, its keys stained with something dark. And at the center of the room was a table, surrounded by a circle of child-sized chairs. On each chair sat a doll. Kearns stepped closer, his heart pounding as he took in the details. Each doll was dressed differently, one in a ballerina's tutu, another in a ringleader's coat, but all of them shared the same disfigured faces. Gouged eyes, slashed mouths, smiles painted too wide. And on the table in front of them, like a centerpiece, was a photograph. Langley picked it up, her face going pale as she held it up for Kearns to see. It was a group picture of a traveling circus troupe, faded and torn around the edges. But it wasn't the faces of the performers that froze the blood in Kearns's veins. It was the figure standing in the background, a tall man in a tattered clown suit, his face half hidden in shadow. And in the corner of the photo, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting as the note they'd found, were the words, "Welcome to the show. Part 9, the spotlight." Kearns stared at the photo, his breath caught in his throat. The clown in the background seemed to loom larger than the others, his presence oppressive despite the stillness of the image. The inked words, "Welcome to the show," felt less like a taunt and more like a challenge. "We're in over our heads," Langley whispered, clutching the edges of the photograph. Her flashlight trembled, casting warped shadows across the walls. "This isn't just some killer. This is a performance," Kearns interrupted grimly, the realization sinking in like a knife to his gut. "They're staging this. Every clue, every doll, every body, it's all part of the act." Langley shot him a glance, her face pale. "But why? What's the point?" Kearns didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the dolls seated around the table. He stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating their twisted faces. As he moved, he noticed something else, a faint hum, almost like static coming from somewhere inside the unit. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Langley nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her gun. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" The hum grew louder as Kearns approached the calliope in the corner. The keys glinted dully in the beam of his flashlight, but the machine itself was old and broken, its pipes rusted and crumbling. Yet the sound persisted, rising and falling in a haunting, unnatural melody. Kearns reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing one of the keys. The moment he touched it, the hum stopped, and then the lights went out. Langley cursed as the unit was plunged into darkness. Kearns's flashlight flickered, then died, leaving them in pitch black. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their breathing. "Langley!" Kearns called out, his voice tight. "I'm here," she said, though her voice sounded distant, too distant. Kearns fumbled for his backup flashlight, his hands shaking. When he finally clicked it on, the weak beam revealed Langley standing by the table, her gun drawn. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice low. "I feel like we're being—" The laugh cut her off. It was high-pitched, shrill, and chillingly childlike. It echoed through the unit, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Kearns swung his flashlight around wildly, the beam catching glimpses of the grotesque dolls, their grinning faces seeming to twist and shift in the shadows. "Show yourself!" Langley shouted, her gun trained on the darkness. The laugh came again, louder this time, followed by a faint shuffle of movement. Kearns spun toward the sound, his heart hammering in his chest. His flashlight caught something, a figure, just at the edge of the light. It was tall and thin, its outline unmistakably human, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and Kearns could swear he saw a flash of white, a painted face, grinning. "Langley there," he yelled, but when he turned back to her, his blood turned to ice. Langley was gone. "Langley!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. He swung the flashlight back and forth, but there was no sign of her. Just the empty table, the dolls, and the oppressive darkness. The laugh came again, closer now, followed by a whisper that made Kearns' skin crawl. "Detective, welcome." Kearns spun around, his light falling on the far wall. Something new was there, words scrawled in what looked like fresh blood. "The final act awaits." Part 10, The Cage. Kearns' flashlight quivered in his grip as he stared at the words smeared across the wall. "The final act awaits." The blood glistened, fresh and vivid, as if it had been painted only moments ago. His heart pounded like a drumbeat in the silence that followed the laughter. "Langley," he shouted, his voice raw and desperate. No answer. The storage unit seemed to pulse around him, the walls closing in with every second. He turned back to the table, the grotesque dolls still seated in their macabre circle. Except now, there was one more. Kearns froze, the light catching the edges of its familiar features. It wore a plain black suit, a miniature badge pinned to its chest. Its face, disfigured like the others, bore a horrifying resemblance to Langley. Her name was scrawled across the doll's tiny lapel in crude red letters. Lieutenant Langley. The room spun. His breathing grew shallow as panic clawed at his mind. This can't be real. He approached the doll, his hand trembling as he reached for it. The air around him seemed to thicken, the oppressive silence broken by the faintest sound, a whisper, so soft it could have been a trick of the wind. "Detective?" Kearns whipped around, his flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing. Just shadows that seemed to shift and dance at the edges of his vision. "Where are you?" he growled, his voice hoarse. "What do you want?" The whisper came again, closer this time. "You're almost there. You can't stop now." Something moved at the edge of the light. A flash of color, the faint sound of dragging footsteps. Kearns followed it, his instincts screaming at him to run, to leave, but his feet carried him forward. The far end of the storage unit revealed a door he hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a tattered circus poster. The poster depicted a clown with a wide, painted grin, its arms outstretched as if inviting him inside. Kearns hesitated. Everything about the door screamed trap, but he couldn't turn back. Not with Langley gone, not with the answers so close. He pushed the door open, the rusted hinges groaning like a dying animal. What lay beyond made his stomach twist. The space was larger than it should have been, impossibly vast. Strings of dim, flickering lights hung from above, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. In the center of the room was a cage, an old, rusted thing with iron bars that glistened wetly in the faint light. Inside the cage was Langley. Her head was slumped forward, her hands bound behind her back. Kearns rushed to the bars, his heart pounding. "Langley, can you hear me?" She stirred, her head lifting slowly. Her eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "Kay Kearns," she rasped, her voice barely audible. "I'm getting you out," he said, gripping the bars. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the room feel alive. "Just hang on." As he looked for a way to unlock the cage, the lights above flared suddenly, blinding him. A spotlight clicked on, focusing on the cage and illuminating a figure standing just beyond it. It was the clown. No, not just the clown, it was him, the figure from the photograph. His tattered costume swayed as he moved, his painted face twisted into an unnatural grin that stretched wider than any human face should. His eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light as he tilted his head, studying Kearns. "Welcome to the grand finale, Detective," the clown said, his voice low and gravelly, yet eerily calm. Kearns raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Let her go." The clown chuckled, the sound deep and hollow. "Oh, you're not here to save her. You're here to join her." Before Kearns could respond, the lights above flickered again, and the room plunged into darkness. The laughter echoed around him, growing louder and more chaotic, filling his ears until he couldn't think. When the lights returned, Langley was gone. So was the clown. Kearns stood in the empty room, the cage still swinging slightly as if it had just been vacated. On the floor at his feet was a card, its edges singed. He picked it up, his blood running cold as he read the words written in that same jagged handwriting. "It's your turn now. Part 11, The Abyss." Kearns staggered back, the card in his hand shaking as though it burned. His flashlight flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the room. The cage, the faintly swinging bars. Everything seemed surreal, as if the world had been warped into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. He turned in circles, his gun raised, but the room was empty now. Just him and the cage. And the card. "Langley," he shouted, his voice cracking, the sound swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Nothing. He looked down at the card again. The words, "It's your turn now," stared back at him, taunting him. On the other side, a crude map had been drawn, leading back into Ravenswood. The destination was clear, the abandoned fairgrounds at the edge of town. Kearns cursed under his breath. Of course it was the fairgrounds, the site of a long-dead traveling circus, shuttered years ago after rumors of scandal and disappearances. Most of the town avoided it now, claiming it was cursed. He forced himself to move, pocketing the card as he left the building. Outside, the air was thick and stifling, the night feeling heavier than it should. The drive to the fairgrounds was a blur, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts. Langley was alive. He had to believe that. But the image of the clown's face, those unnatural, glowing eyes, haunted him like a phantom. The fairgrounds were a ruin of decayed wood and rusted metal, overgrown with weeds and shadowed by twisted trees. Kearns stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots unnaturally loud. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating faded signs and broken-down rides. As he approached the main tent, a sagging, skeletal structure that loomed like a corpse, the wind picked up, carrying faint sounds. A creaking swing, the echo of distant music barely audible. And then a voice. "Step right up, Detective Kearns. The show is about to begin." The voice boomed from nowhere and everywhere, deep and theatrical, dripping with mockery. Kearns spun around, his gun drawn, but the fairgrounds were empty. "Who are you?" Kearns demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "Why are you doing this?" Laughter answered him, rising in pitch until it seemed to echo from the very walls of the tent. Kearns pressed forward, the sound gnawing at his nerves. Inside the tent, the air was cold and rank, the faint glow of a single, flickering spotlight guiding him toward the center. There, under the light, was Langley. She was bound to a chair, her head slumped forward, her body eerily still. A shiver of dread ran through Kearns as he approached her, his steps hesitant. "Langley," he whispered. Her head lifted slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Kearns," she rasped, her voice barely audible. "It's a trap." Before Kearns could respond, the spotlight above them flared, blinding him. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When his vision cleared, Langley was gone. In her place stood the clown. It was a human. Kearns could see that now. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like a marionette without strings. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. The glowing eyes locked onto him, and Kearns felt as though he were being pulled into an abyss. "You've done well to get this far," the clown said, its voice a low, guttural purr. "But the final act is not for the faint of heart." "What do you want?" Kearns demanded, his gun trained on the creature. "I want you to see," the clown replied, tilting its head. "I want you to remember." "Remember what?" Kearns shouted, his frustration boiling over. The clown's grin widened. "Who you really are." The world around Kearns began to shift, the tent melting away into a chaotic swirl of colors and sounds. His heart raced as memories flooded back, fractured images of faces, places, things he couldn't place. Blood, a knife, laughter that wasn't his own. The clown stepped closer, its glowing eyes piercing. The truth, detective. It's always been inside you. Kearns's knees buckled, the weight of the revelation crushing him. The killer wasn't just playing a game. It was unearthing something buried deep within him, something he couldn't face. Part 12, the final curtain. Kearns staggered, his mind reeling as the world around him twisted into a kaleidoscope of memories and distorted sounds. The clown's glowing eyes bored into him, a hypnotic pull dragging him closer to the truth he had been chasing and running from all along. "You don't remember, do you?" The clown purred, its voice both mocking and strangely tender. "The wheel turns, detective. It always does." "No," Kearns whispered, shaking his head. "You're lying." "I don't." "Don't what?" The clown's grin widened. "Don't want to remember?" The swirling chaos around them sharpened suddenly, coalescing into a single memory. Kearns saw himself in a small, dilapidated house, his hands slick with blood. A young woman lay on the floor, her lifeless eyes staring up at him. Her features were familiar. Langley's? No, someone else. A name rose unbidden to his lips. "Ellie." The clown clapped its hands, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. There it is, the truth, in all its messy, glorious horror. The memory played on, vivid and unrelenting. Kearns saw his younger self, desperate and panicked, stuffing the woman's body into a trunk. He saw the trunk being buried under the cover of night, deep in the woods outside Ravenswood. "No," Kearns said again, his voice trembling. "That's not me. I'm not a killer." The clown's laughter rang out, high and sharp. "Oh, but you are. You always have been. This show, this circus, it's all yours, detective." The realization hit Kearns like a freight train. The killer's taunts, the intricate staging of the crimes, the uncanny familiarity of the clues, it all made sense now. This wasn't someone else's game. It was his. But why? Kearns asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would I?" "Because you wanted to forget," the clown interrupted, stepping closer. "You built walls in your mind, locked away the truth. But the wheel turns, detective. You couldn't hide forever." Kearns dropped to his knees, the weight of the revelation crushing him. The clown loomed over him, its grin impossibly wide. "What happens now?" Kearns asked, his voice hollow. The clown leaned in, its glowing eyes inches from his own. "Now the show goes on." When Kearns opened his eyes, he was back in the interrogation room at the station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and Langley was sitting across from him, her arms crossed. "You passed out," she said, her tone skeptical. "Harding's still missing, and now you're spacing out on us? What the hell is going on with you?" Kearns blinked, his mind racing. The memories were hazy now, slipping through his fingers like smoke. The clown, the truth, it felt distant like a dream. But the dread in his chest was real. I don't know," he muttered. "I need some air." Langley frowned, but didn't stop him as he stumbled out of the room. Outside, the night was cool and quiet, the town of Ravenswood eerily still. Kearns lit a cigarette with shaking hands, his eyes darting to the shadows. As he took a drag, something caught his eye, a flyer pinned to a nearby telephone pole. It was old and weathered, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. A clown, its arms outstretched in welcome. Beneath it were the words, "The wheel turns. Coming soon." Kearns's cigarette fell from his lips, the ember hissing as it hit the ground. He backed away, his heart pounding. Somewhere in the distance, faint and mocking, he heard the sound of laughter. Epilogue. Months later, a young officer at the Ravenswood precinct was going through cold case files when he stumbled upon a photo of an old carnival troupe. In the background, partially obscured, stood a tall man in a suit, a detective, not a performer. The officer squinted, the figure's face tugging at the edges of recognition. "Hey, doesn't this look like Detective Kearns?" he asked aloud. But Kearns wasn't there to answer. He'd vanished weeks ago, leaving behind only his badge, a crumpled clown doll, and a single note. The show must go on.
Subscribe and like this video.